Okay, let's get into it, guys. Tonight, for this dream session, I want to talk about the concept of the spirit or the soul and how it physically applies to our life, where the mythology of the spirit comes from, how a local elemental deity became the one God at the heart of three world religions. This is something I've been studying for a while. We've talked about it a little bit in the past, but let's really dig into this tonight in this dream session. So get your cup of coffee, get your cup of tea, roll up, light up, whatever you want to do, get comfortable, because this is probably going to be a pretty long one. So, the spirit or the soul, the entire concept for it, it's originally based on the ancient understanding of air. Hear me out. The old Latin word spiritus meant breath. The Greek word pneuma, where we get the word pneumonia from, it also meant breath. But to them, breath was spirit. It was the same thing. So it meant both, because there was no difference between them. There was only one word used for all of those things back then. In the Chinese tradition, it was called qi. In Hinduism, it was called prana, the life force within you. And when you suffocate, or if you don't have any air left in you, then that's when you die. To them, when you breathe out your last breath, that's when your soul leaves your body. In Hebrew, the word Ruach also meant breath, spirit, or wind. Ruach was the word that was used to describe all of those things. The Great Spirit or the Holy Spirit was the air all around them. And we seem to get the breath of life from that life-giving force. You know, it held up the sky and the stars. It created the clouds and the rain from seemingly nothing. We can feel it all around us, but we can't seem to touch it or grasp it. You can't really see it until it reveals itself in the form of mist or smoke. It's strong enough to destroy a city, but it's gentle enough for us to move through effortlessly. And I see a lot of similarities between the Holy Trinity and the three states of matter. You know, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, solid, liquid, and gas. I don't know, I'm just saying. And to them, it wasn't physical. To them, it was a non-physical thing, but it still could have physical properties, just like this God. And we can see how smoke, fire, and mist would all fit in a similar category for ancient people in the way that it seems non-physical. Sometimes maybe even invisible, but when it does take shape, it can affect the physical world, just like smoke and fire and mist. Ancient gods were elemental, you know, sandstorms, thunderstorms, and scholars do consider Yahweh to originally be a storm and a warrior god. Ancient people didn't understand that air is particulate matter, so to them, it was the omnipresent life force. And in a way, it kinda is. Air gives us life, and it does seem to be all around us. It wasn't until the 1600s when scientists started to show through their experiments that air is actually a material substance, and it's not a mystical substance. This is when the word spirit started to be used specifically as an individual's life force, and not just as breath or air. And this is overwhelmingly apparent when you start reading texts from before and after this time period. Of course, through human nature and through evolution and as a cognitive species, we started to conceptualize these things differently. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. So we got used to the concept of a spirit, and once we realized that air is particulate matter, we didn't get rid of the idea of the spirit, we just separated it from the idea of air. So it seems like because we've gotten so used to the idea of a spirit or a soul, we still haven't let it go, even though we understand the difference between spirit and air now. We've evolved to recognize patterns and predict them effectively for survival, obviously, and for efficiency. Obviously, pattern recognition has its benefits for learning, growing, predicting, and adjusting. And over tens of thousands of years, the people that adapted those traits survived. And the ones that didn't, they're the ones that died off. So our brains are hardwired for pattern recognition. Now, as a social species, we've learned that individual survival won't last. We know we can't survive on our own, but collectively, we can work together, and that's the most effective way to make sure that our species can survive. Now, we can't kill an elephant alone, but 20 of us can. If you keep the fire going and cook while I go and get water and start working on the shelter, then tonight we can eat, drink, and have shelter, but we can't do it alone. So we kind of need each other, and this is how our basic foundations of morality and social constructs are obviously formed. We need to care about each other to survive, and we need to survive to be able to care about each other. It's not a strictly selfish foundation of morality. You know, we want our species to survive. We also need animals and nature and a whole functioning ecosystem. So we have good reason to care about the earth, and it's not just selfish. We've developed empathy, obviously, because this is a symbiotic function. We want to help people because we know what it feels like to need help. And we know what it feels like to need help because we need help. So we know that we need to help others. We care about others because they are us. And that's not a religious statement, I gotta be clear here. Whether you believe in the Big Bang or young Earth creation, you'll still essentially agree that we came from some type of unity. The atheist and some religious people might even say it was the Big Bang, and that we're made from stardust. That's the general scientific consensus. So we're all the same essential stuff. We're just spread out in different forms. Religious fundamentalists would obviously say that we're made from God, or God made man in his image. And mystics would say, as above, so below. It's the same thing, and I think a strong argument can be made for some type of fundamental unity. We have the ability to empathize with others because we're all different pieces of the same stuff, essentially. So we see ourselves in others, and we see others in ourselves too. This is pretty well reflected in the scientific law of conservation, which says that energy and matter are never created or destroyed. They just change form. But of course, that argument doesn't say anything about a specific religion. Just because we all may have came from some type of unity, it definitely is not personified and anthropomorphized the way that religions do. So this is not saying anything about a specific religion. And it's cool to say that basically all religions are pointing to that same essential concept in some way. But even if that is the case, the conceptualization, the interpretations, the translations, they've all definitely muddied the waters a lot. Basically, every single theme and literally every story in the Old and New Testament, from the characters to the lessons, can be traced through history in other writings, inscriptions, and artifacts that are cross-analyzed and dated with multiple methods, which show that the dates are accurate. And looking at ancient myths by other cultures, it shows how clear the development of the Bible is. Not the historical accuracy of the Bible, but the mythological evolution. Just studying the surrounding cultures, it shows the clear motivations for most of the biblical texts. Socially, politically, theologically, literally, it's everywhere. So stick with me here. This concept is also basically why every culture throughout history has held beliefs about metaphysical beings. Our brains are hardwired to assume something is there, even when it isn't. When ancient people saw the grass moving in the distance, some could assume it's just the wind, and some could assume that it's a tiger. Sometimes it was a tiger, so the ones that assumed it was a tiger in the grass, they would be the ones that survived. The ones that just assume it's the wind, they would be the ones that would quickly get removed from the gene pool. We're all the descendants of primates who used their imagination to assume that things existed, even when they didn't exist. Because the ones that did survive, they assumed that the tiger was there. They're our ancestors. The ones that assumed it was the wind, they're the ones that died off. As a social species, we have a deeply ingrained understanding that if we do things to harm people or the world around us, or if we act in a strictly selfish way, then we're ultimately hurting ourselves and the future of our offspring. So our moral standards and the ethics are an emergent property of social mechanisms, and this doesn't make them any less significant. This actually highlights their significance and gives us an actual, observable, testable, and verifiable foundation for them. So when religious people try to tell me I have no foundation for my morals and that I'm borrowing my moral ethics from religions, it's actually the other way around. Just like with the tiger in the grass, ancient people understood if they do something wrong, like something selfish or destructive to others or the world around them, then something might be watching or someone might be watching. And you never really know for sure whether or not someone might catch you, so generally, it's safer to just assume someone is always watching you. This is a survival mechanism. So over thousands of years, we've developed this deeply ingrained feeling that someone's always watching us. And it's deeply rooted in us genetically. Now, of course, there's always going to be people with bad judgment. There's always going to be destructive, selfish people. And they generally end up in jail or in mental hospitals or suicidal or outcast. We can say that the world is evil and greedy, but I have no doubt that humans are generally good. I don't think we would have survived this long, and I don't think we would have dominated so much otherwise. Unless you believe in some other sort of rise and fall of mankind, and if you think we've had other technology before this rise of mankind and all that type of crazy stuff, we could talk about that some other time. But as far as we know, for this rise, this version of humanity, based on all the historical records we have for us right now, this is the best time to be alive. I think when some people are trying to romanticize the past too much, I don't think they appreciate modern medicine enough or just the technology around us. There's cameras everywhere. Kidnappings, robbery, theft, murders, all those things are generally going down. On a wide scale, of course, there's always going to be certain problems in certain areas, but by and large, the world has gotten so much better. Statistically, by pretty much every measure, and I don't think that people appreciate that enough. These same psychological survival mechanisms explain why humans are so fascinated with negativity and hysterical news stories. This is why the crazy headlines get the most attention, because throughout our entire development we had to be aware of the most dangerous things going on around us. If there was a tiger in the village eating people, we needed to know everything we could about it so we could survive and save our families and our friends. If there's something mundane or unextraordinary going on, it's just not as important for us to use any brain power or energy to understand it. That's why so many people are so fascinated with murder stories and forensic cases, even if they don't realize it. This is why clickbait works. Anyone who studies the psychology of communication understands this. No one wants to listen to a story that doesn't include a struggle. It feels like a waste of time almost. If there's no challenge, if there's no resistance, if there's no arc of development, then no one cares to read the book or watch the movie. This is the first key thing that you have to understand when you're trying to write a script or a story. There is no story without a struggle. No one wants to listen to it. And this is why controversy sells. And let's keep in mind how much religions are full of apocalyptic prophets and fear and salvation too. So we have this propensity towards survival, growth, development, and understanding that guides our decisions. We feel like there's always someone watching. We're drawn to drama. We're selfish at times from the most primitive survival influences, but we have the ability and the desire to empathize with other beings and even all the things around us. Because people who did all of these things have generally been the ones that survived and procreated. So eventually, people started to assign different agents to that feeling that they get, that feeling that someone's always watching, which is just an ingrained survival mechanism. So they started to believe it was their ancestors or angels or even the Holy Spirit, because that air is all around us. With air being this omnipresent life-giving force within us and all around us, it's pretty much natural for us to equate it with that deeply ingrained feeling of always being watched. This is why humans feel the need to be grateful to the Holy Spirit for life, because air gives us life, but we also fear the Holy Spirit at the same time, because it brings great destruction as far as we could tell. To the ancient people, spirits could take lots of different forms, but most deities were elemental, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, sandstorms, and things like that. They were always attributed to some type of god. This is also why we call alcohol spirits. If you look above a bottle of strong alcohol, you'll see that wavy, distorted air or the smoke from an oil lamp. And this is likely where we get the idea of the genie in the lamp or the jinn. I have a deep dive on the history of angels and demons, and I talk more about the genie in that. You should definitely check that out. And this is also why we say God bless you, because people used to believe that when you sneeze, the soul would leave the body and it would be vulnerable to evil spirits until you breathe it back in, because to them, the air was spirit. Psalm 104, 29-30 says, when God takes away breath, creatures die. When he sends his spirit, they're created. In the original language, the word Ruach is used. So when God takes away Ruach, creatures die. When he sends his Ruach, they're created. In the original language, it was Ruach for both. It's only in the later translation that they use two different words, because back then, it was the same thing to them. Genesis 2:7 says God breathes the breath of life into Adam, making him a living being. So Adam was just a figure that God fashioned out of clay from the earth, and then God gave Adam breath. He breathed his life into him, his Ruach. They thought that breath was the soul. In Job 33:4 it says, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Ruach again was used for spirit and breath. We also know that wind makes waves, and what does it say in the beginning of Genesis? The spirit or the Ruach of God moved on the face of the water. Wind creates waves on the water. The Holy Spirit was the air, and what you think of as your spirit is your breath. Of course, thousands of years of mythology and translation mixed with some scientific understanding and innovation has caused us to inevitably separate these two concepts. But we still hold on to that innate connection with that misunderstood assumption of the spirit. God is the tiger in the grass. It sort of reminds me of Pascal's wager, which is used by lots of religious people to try to defend their faith in God. Pascal was a mathematician, a physicist, an inventor, and a philosopher, and basically he said that believing in God is the most rational choice. Because if God exists, then the believer gains eternity in heaven. But not believing leaves you the chance of eternal damnation, of course, if God does actually exist. So it's better to just believe it anyway, since we don't really know. See what I mean? It's like the tiger in the grass. The key difference here is that ancient people actually saw tigers, and they witnessed the repercussions of not believing in it. We can demonstrate that tigers exist, so yes, it's better to assume that there's a tiger in the grass. But assuming that something like the biblical God exists is pretty much a malfunction of that adaptation. Now that we know what air and breath is, we don't call that soul anymore, but we just use the word soul to fill that gap now. Some might want to say that the human frequency is the soul, but the frequencies emitted by our brains, our hearts, and our bodies emerge from the activity that's in our bodies. I do think that frequency might be fundamental in a way, but that's a different conversation. I have a video about the human aura and biofields, and one about the geomagnetic field of the earth. I will link those in the comments, or if you're on TikTok, just check my page. I think there's something beautiful about air being spirit though. I would say that our frequencies could be argued to be the aura, but there's not really much of an argument to say that those are the soul. Even in Greek mythology, the wind isn't just one entity, it's a bunch of different figures. First, there was Aeolus. He was not a god of the wind, but he was the wind's keeper. He was depicted as a benevolent ruler that controlled the four cardinal winds and kept them contained until it was necessary to release them. But the winds themselves, they were called the anemoi, which looked like men with wings. They were sons of Eos, who was the goddess of the dawn. Boreas was the fierce god of the north wind. He was responsible for the cold of winter and storms, and he was thought of as a strong, bearded, and powerful god. Zephyrus was known as the gentle god of the west wind. He was associated with soft springs and flowers and new life. Nodus or Notus controlled the south wind, the wetness and the mist that you get from late summer and autumn storms. And Eurus was the god of the east wind, sometimes seen as less favorable because he would bring dry conditions. And then of course the Romans adopted that same mythology and they just kind of switched out the names. But in ancient Egypt, they had the god Shu, and he was the god of air, atmosphere, and breath. He usually had a headdress with tall feathers, and he was a primordial deity. He separated the sky goddess known as Nut from the earth god Geb, and literally created the space that we breathe in. Obviously, in Norse mythology, they have gods that represent elements in lots of ways. People are relatively familiar with most of them. But across the Atlantic, in Aztec mythology, they had Quetzalcoatl. He was the feathered serpent, and he had a deep connection to the wind in his manifestation known as Ehecatl. He's usually shown with a mask that looks like a bird's beak, and they believe that he would blow the wind through that beak to sweep the path clear for the rain. In Japan, they believed in this mythological figure known as Fujian or Futen. He was known as a god of the wind, and he was shown with like red hair and green skin. He was like a type of demon, usually shown alongside his brother Reijin or Rajin, who was the god of thunder. And obviously this is also who inspired Raiden for Mortal Kombat 2. In Hinduism, Vayu, or sometimes also called Prana, he was the main deity of the wind and the air and breath itself. He was a powerful Vedic god. In Yoruba religion, there was a goddess known as Oya. She was a powerful Orisha, which was a deity of winds, lightning, and violent storms. She was also linked to the Niger River. She was known for her transformative energy and her ability to bring all types of changes. So this story of how humanity came to understand and start to redefine this divine feeling, it is one of incredible complexity and transformation. And the story of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, he's a perfect example of that journey, and one that's deeply intertwined with these elemental forces. So let's go through that a little bit. Yahweh is recognized by scholars as a warrior storm god. And you can really get a sense of what Yahweh was originally kind of felt as if you just think of the power of a storm with the dark sky and the rumbling of the air and the cracking of the lightning. That's the type of feeling, the type of power that these people associated with Yahweh. Across the ancient Mesopotamian world, the gods of fire and storm were a big deal to them. But fire wasn't just about destruction to them. Fire was about purification, judgment, power, and regeneration too. There was also storm gods like Baal in Canaan or Adad in Mesopotamia who controlled rain and thunder. Their imagery is always with lightning, which is fire in the sky, and clouds, which is air and smoke. The reason all of this is important to understand is because Yahweh, in his earliest forms, he actually shared a lot of these traits with these gods. He started as a storm god, like a warrior deity from the southern deserts. His roots are way down in the rugged lands of Edom and Teman, which is basically southern Jordan these days. From there, originally he was seen as the god that was behind the deadly thunderstorms and flash floods that could tear through the desert. You see it in the Bible. Yahweh shows up in pillars of clouds, leading his people through the wilderness, and by night a pillar of fire. So this is a perfect description of a volcano, a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. I don't know. That's Exodus 13:21-22. He's a warrior that's leading armies and using storms as weapons, like in Psalm 18:7-15, where the earth shakes and smokes as he unleashes his fury. That fiery, shaky imagery, that lines up pretty well with volcanic activity too, which just adds to the sense of raw elemental power. Volcanoes kind of contain all the elements we've talked about so far. Fire and smoke, and even when they erupt, they cause lightning storms. Think about the big moment at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19:18. That says the mountain was covered in smoke because Yahweh came down in fire, and the whole mountain shook. Maybe it's just poetic, but it sounds a lot like a volcanic eruption to me. The Bible also mentions brimstone, which is sulfur, that's classic volcano material. Modern scholars say that early Israelites might have associated Yahweh with volcanic power, especially with the geography of the ancient Midian and northwest Arabia where volcanoes were all over. Of course, religious people try to tell me the Bible couldn't have been talking about volcanoes because there were no active volcanoes in that area. Well, let's get into that a little bit, because we know the literal story of the Exodus couldn't have possibly happened. Not at all like the Bible describes it, at least. But these ancient writers definitely would have been familiar with volcanoes, and similar things like the Exodus have happened throughout history, of course. So that doesn't make the story true though. The Bible places Mount Sinai in the wilderness of Sinai in Exodus 19. It's usually identified with Jabal Musa in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula now. This whole region has no evidence of recent volcanic activity. The last activity was like 550 million years ago. But if anything like the Exodus did happen, it couldn't have happened in that area the way that it's explained in the Bible. So let me just rant on this real quick. The Bible claims that about 600,000 adult Israelite men left Egypt, implying a total population of 2 to 3 million people when women and children are included, which they would have been in the Exodus. When women and children are included, that large group would have been one of the largest populations in the world at that time. A lot bigger than most ancient cities and even some nations. The Sinai Desert could not have supported millions of people and their livestock for 40 years at all. So when they say that these people in the Exodus were wandering in this desert for 40 years, there literally wasn't even enough food or water available for that to be possible. Archaeology hasn't found any evidence at all, like campsites, trash, or graves at all, that such a massive group would have lived in the Sinai for decades like that. The numbers also create internal biblical problems too. Based on the genealogy in the Bible itself, these would have been impossibly large families based on the census of firstborns, and it contradicts other passages that try to describe Israel as a small nation. So some say that the numbers are exaggerated and they say that it was much smaller numbers. Maybe it was, but if 2 to 3 million people were to walk in a straight line through the Sinai Desert, the line would be so long that the first people would get to the end way before the last ones even left the starting point. So a lot of the fundamentalists will say, no, the numbers are right. Those people were just stuck in the desert because God was punishing them for a multitude of different reasons. So if it was 2 to 3 million people, assuming each person needs about 1 meter of space, 600,000 men alone would make the line 600 kilometers, about 373 miles long. And it would have been way longer if families, animals, and all their belongings were included. The Sinai Peninsula itself is only about 2 to 250 kilometers, or 125 to 155 miles across, at its widest. Even at a normal walking speed, it would literally be impossible for such a long line to move as a single group without the front getting there before the people in the back even started. I heard a funny quote once: if you're trying to walk from Egypt to Canaan, it'll take a few weeks, but with the help of God, it'll take 40 years. There's just no way that even a fraction of that amount of people could have been in that desert for that long without leaving any evidence anyways. But it's not just around Sinai that Yahweh was associated with volcanoes in the Bible. Yahweh also answers with fire in the showdown with the prophets of Baal and Kings, where he burned up the sacrifice and everything around it. That's destruction, but it's also purification in a way. A volcano wipes the slate clean. So this blend of air, storm, and fire is what helped Yahweh go from just a local god to this cosmic powerhouse that we know of. Yahweh basically absorbed the best of all the elemental gods, the air, the storm, the fire, and it turned into something bigger. It turned into a symbol of creation and destruction. We don't know how to even pronounce the name Yahweh, YHWH, and there is no wide scholarly agreement on it. The most widely accepted pronunciation is Yahweh, but none of them are too sure about it. Ancient Hebrew scripts didn't include vowels. They were spoken and understood based on the writing of the consonants. And also because the Jews thought it was too holy to say the name, they replaced it with Adonai, which meant Lord, or Hashem, which meant the name. Later on, the Hebrew scribes added vowel marks and they worked the vowels from Adonai into Yahweh to get Yehovah or Jehovah. Or some say Yohe-Vahe, Yahweh, Yohe-Vahe, Yehovah, all from YHWH. And the etymology gets more complex than people even realize, but some say it's more of an onomatopoeia for our breath, like it's supposed to emulate the sound of our breathing. No, Yahweh, Yahweh, in and out. There's really no solid agreement on any of that though. How can we actually know any of this is true? I wanted to know, how do we trace these ancient origins? The earliest solid historical evidence for Yahweh actually comes from outside of the Bible. There's the Mesha Stele. It's a stone monument from around 840 BC. It was set up by King Mesha of Moab. That was a neighboring kingdom to Israel. And in his inscription, King Mesha basically talked about his victories over Israel, and it specifically says he took cultic objects that belonged to Yahweh from an Israelite town. He wasn't some hidden deity, he was on the regional stage already. But he was still one god that was among others in this ancient Near Eastern pantheon at the moment. We could go back even farther than that though, thanks to some ancient Egyptian inscriptions as far back as 12 or 1300 BC. They talk about the Shasu of Yahweh. The Shasu at the time were known to be nomadic groups that roamed around the rugged, arid lands of the southern Levant. These were areas like Midian and the Sinai Peninsula. So this is significant because it shows the worship of a deity named Yahweh by these desert nomads centuries before the establishment of the Israelite monarchy. This reinforces the idea of Yahweh as a desert god. Call me crazy, but the more I learned this stuff, I couldn't help but think about these desert tribes and the conditions that they would have been living in, with sandstorms and mirages. When you look across the desert and you see the wavy air above the land in the hot sun, that's a type of mirage. That's called heat haze or heat shimmer. And obviously, mirages are a real thing. We can hallucinate, and it doesn't have to be a metaphysical experience. We can see how these things are false images. Just check out some optical illusions and you'll see how these things actually work and how the brain can trick us. But before the days of MRIs and EEGs and neurology, we can understand why people had supernatural explanations for all of these things. And I have to emphasize again, this doesn't take the magic out of it, because understanding that a hallucination isn't actually a separate conscious being standing there, that doesn't mean it's not fascinating or interesting. It answers one question, it gives us clarity on that one false understanding. It shows us that it's a mental projection. But even that itself is fascinating, and that opens us up to even more questions. So it's not like science is a one-way dead-end road. So building on this whole cultural formation of Yahweh, the Canaanite hypothesis says that Yahweh might have originally been the deity of the Canaanites, which was another group that lived in this southern area, and they were known for their skills in metallurgy. So just think about metalworking and how it involves the intense heat and the roaring furnaces and the transformation of raw earth through fire. A deity associated with these people can easily be linked to fire, mountains, and subterranean forces. All of this kind of echoes that raw elemental power. You can also see around this time that people started writing more stories about dreams and visions. This was another way for people to connect with unseen forces, because dreams are another seemingly non-physical experience that they inevitably would connect the supernatural or magical forces to. In the ancient world, dreams weren't just random, they were seen as legitimate direct channels for gods to speak to humans. Obviously, you could think about Joseph in Genesis, who interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, or Daniel, which is my favorite book of the Bible. He was decoding the king's nightmares. A dream could be a divine message, it could be a warning, it could be a prophecy. They were a glimpse into the unseen realm of the Ruach, or the spirit. It was another way the invisible, powerful Ruach, or spirit, could make itself known. So, we've got this powerful elemental god that's tied to the wind, fire, and storms, and he's speaking through dreams. But then what about all the other gods that were surrounding him? When the groups who turned into the Israelites started to settle in Canaan, they stepped into this land that was full of other deities. The Canaanite pantheon was stacked with El, who was the wise old father god. Dr. Justin Sledge claims that if the image of God in your mind is this wise, powerful man sitting on a throne, then that comes from El. That was originally a Canaanite god. And Baal was the dynamic storm god for them, and he was known for rain and fertility. Now Asherah was the powerful mother goddess, and she was El's consort. You could check out my full deep dive on the history of angels and demons to learn more about that. But this is where it gets really interesting, because even though the later biblical texts draw a hard line, early on there was a lot of overlap between Yahweh and these other gods. Yahweh wasn't a big deal in the original Canaanite pantheon that we know from places like Ugarit. In Ugarit, they have texts that show the details of their myths and their rituals, and there's no evidence of Yahweh at all in the older depictions. So this whole absence from the core Canaanite pantheon is even more evidence of Yahweh's non-Canaanite and likely southern origin. But as the Israelites lived along these people, Yahweh started to pick up traits from those other gods. Over a long period of time, Yahweh basically took over El's role as the supreme fatherly God. You could see El's characteristics and titles start to get applied directly to Yahweh in the Israelite texts. And for Baal, Yahweh pretty much stepped into that storm god's shoes. And common people in these areas, they were illiterate and they were mostly focused on their everyday lives. The deep, intricate details and philosophies of religion weren't widely understood, and they didn't generally care what you called your god. To them, Yahweh and El could be the same person. Like, call it whatever you want, it's the God that makes it rain, and we'll praise it whatever it is. Of course, the scribes and the priests and the leaders had their own agendas, and from them we can see the more complex blendings of theologies. But still, Yahweh clearly evolved by absorbing traits from El and Baal, which would make sense in a world where gods were always borrowing from each other anyway. And then there's Asherah. And this one surprises a lot of people. The archaeological evidence and the ancient texts clearly show that Yahweh, the God of Israel, once had a divine partner named Asherah. A statue of Asherah was in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem for centuries. It's said that there was women, or the Bible calls them prostitutes, because clearly they had an agenda later on to make Asherah look bad, but it's said that these women wove these detailed artistic ritual fabrics for her in this temple. The Bible has plenty references to Asherahs in the plural, which scholars now do understand refers to the goddess Asherah and her sacred symbols, which again shows undoubtedly that early Israelites worshipped her alongside Yahweh. There's a command in Deuteronomy against planting trees dedicated to Asherah next to Yahweh, which shows her common worship. Some prophets, like Elijah, even condemn the worship of Baal and Asherah. They say in the 7th century BC, King Josiah took the Asherah pole out of the temple, he burned it and ground it into powder, which would mean that she was in Yahweh's temple up until that time. About 60 miles southeast of the Jerusalem temple, in the Israelite fortress known as Telerad, they had a temple dedicated to Yahweh. It was like a scaled down version of the first Jerusalem temple. In that temple, they had two big stone altars. One was a little bit smaller than the other one. They said the big altar represented Yahweh and the smaller altar represented Asherah. The big altar had residue of frankincense that they would have been burning on it, and the smaller altar actually had cannabis residue that they tested in 2020. So these ancient Israelites were burning cannabis in the temple of Yahweh. There's no evidence anywhere around that area that they were cultivating cannabis. It doesn't seem like they were growing it. It is possible that it grew wild in that area, but it would have been used a lot in this temple. Archaeologists say it was probably imported either from areas like Lebanon, Central Asia, or even Egypt, which in Egypt, cannabis was used for medicine and for rituals pretty often. And there were definitely trade routes from Judah to those places. This also shows that these people would have been intermingling with each other around this time, and explains really clearly why some of their mythologies would have taken on some of the same traits. There's inscriptions from Kuntalet Ajrud around 800 BC that mention Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah, with drawings that go along with them showing Yahweh and Asherah. And then people keep finding hundreds of these small clay figurines of a fertility goddess that were found in homes all throughout Judah. Archaeologists call them the Judean pillar figurines. These are from around the 8th to 7th century BC, but they were a symbol of Asherah. So Asherah was a major Canaanite goddess. Let's give her the credit she deserves. The patriarchy of the churches has been trying to diminish her historical significance. She was the consort of the high god El and the mother of the gods, according to the Ugaritic text. And early Israelite religion was definitely influenced by this whole pantheon. So over the centuries, through lots of political and theological shifts, Asherah got pretty much systematically erased out of the Israelite religion. Her worship was condemned and the references to her were clearly purged or rewritten in the Bible. But despite that, there was still that need for this divine feminine energy in society. And this potentially was reflected in the personification of wisdom in the Bible. It refers to the concept of wisdom and other things as feminine. And there's also the Kabbalistic concept of the Shekinah and the high status of the Virgin Mary in Christianity, so they basically filled that void for them. I should also mention that the word Ruach is a feminine noun, so translators have been talking about the feminine nature of the Holy Spirit for a long time. The removal of Asherah also coincided with the centralization of the religious authority in male priestly hands. So this wide open, dynamic, evolving view of Yahweh wasn't just an early Israel thing. The Elephantine papyri from a Jewish military colony in Egypt in the 5th century BC shows people worshiping Yahweh alongside other gods like Anat Yahu, which is a blend of the Canaanite goddess and Yahweh. Even during the Persian period, when monotheistic ideas were strengthening in Judea, different forms of Yahwism still existed, and that shows there was a variety of beliefs and practices for people who identified with Yahweh. And visually, it's pretty easy to see this too. Judean coins and jar handles from the Persian period show different images that represent Yahweh. There's one that's like a figure on a winged throne with other animal symbols around it, and these show that people were envisioning and representing him, and sometimes they pulled from broader Near Eastern iconography. This was obviously before the strict ban on images of God really took hold, so Yahwism was still always diverse from this abstract concept and on for quite a while. And there was just different communities picturing and worshiping Yahweh in different ways at this time. I just wanted to emphasize that here, because if Yahweh is truly the one true God, then for some reason, he didn't start out that way. And clearly, he didn't mind having a wife and borrowing directly from more ancient icons for a while at least. So we gotta wonder how this wild, elemental, and sometimes partnered God, which was worshipped in all different ways, ended up as the one invisible, universal God that we know from later traditions. The prophets were a big part of this, and they advocated for exclusive loyalty to Yahweh, and they started to condemn the worship of other gods. So does it make sense that Yahweh is the one true God and people were just so confused for so long he couldn't get humans to exclusively believe in him? They'll say he gave us free will and we're tainted with sin or blinded by Satan. But let's consider the narrative in the stories that one true God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, had to intervene and even wiped out vast portions of the population for becoming wicked and worshiping false idols. So those people clearly didn't have free will, or God didn't let them express that free will. I mean, he scattered the people that were building the Tower of Babel because they got too prideful. So clearly, they weren't allowed to have free will either. And there's way too many examples of God intervening with free will. And if man was made in God's image, and God is perfect, and God made the world good, and all creations were good, and he knew free will was going to screw us up so bad, then what are we even saying? So now there's literally tens of thousands of different denominations trying to find ways to reinterpret these myths to fit every aspect of their worldview, and none of them agree with each other. They contradict each other and even contradict themselves, until you get to the point where the only possible God that you can reasonably believe in is some nebulous, abstract concept. Because believing in any other specified God commits you to every logical fallacy, literally, and I could go through those and show you why, but I won't do that here. And it commits you to countless contradictions. Or does it make more sense that we all come from an infinite, powerful universe that's not a he, Calling it a he is obviously wrong to even start with. It can't be jealous, it's beyond any human conception clearly, and it couldn't possibly be represented accurately in the ridiculous stories of the Bible. It can't prefer the Israelites as the chosen ones. These are fantastical mythologies, and the reason that so many these days consider this version of this God from our perspective has more to do with the social, political, and psychological reasons than some divine truth behind it. Unless, of course, you interpret the vast majority of it metaphorically and you give it just as much poetic and metaphorical credit as the other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, and so many more. If you want to say the Bible is your favorite metaphorical, mythological interpretation of universal truths, then that's cool too. But I would invite you to really explore some others, because there are so many options that make even more sense than the Bible, and they don't come with as much logical problems. Literature across the human civilization is vast and beautiful. So back to the historical timeline, other empires like Assyria and Babylon rolled in, they conquered Israel and Judah, and they sent the people into exile. This is like between 700 and 500 BC, not to be confused with the Exodus, which, according to the stories of the Bible, would have taken place way before this, although we don't have any evidence of the Exodus being documented before this time. Some would say that there's older Egyptian writings that talk about slaves rising up and leaving Egypt, but that's it. There's none of the details matching the biblical story besides that loose association, which obviously things like that happen across history, but it doesn't support any of the fanciful mythology around it. But with that being said, the exile of the Israelites and Judeans by the Assyrians and the Babylonians did happen, and once that happens, you see the influences and the changes in the mythology. These people were devastated, their land and their temples and everything they knew basically, it was all destroyed. So they had to wonder, if Yahweh was so powerful, why did he let that happen? The answer that the prophets came up with was that Yahweh was using these empires to punish his people for not being loyal enough. This turned Yahweh into a God that wasn't just tied to one place, he was in charge of the whole world. And even over time, historical disasters just forced people to rethink Yahweh, and it made him a universal God who controlled everything, not just Israel. Another pivotal moment was King Josiah's reforms in Judah in the late 7th century BC. Obviously motivated by their religious convictions and their political ambition, Josiah wanted to destroy the local shrines, and he wanted to get rid of worship of all the other deities. He wanted to centralize all legitimate worship on the Jerusalem temple to the exclusive worship of Yahweh. And this laid the groundwork for the eventual triumph of monotheism as we know it in this sense. So the Babylonian exile was a turning point. Now that they were away from their land and their temple, the Jewish leaders and the scribes started pulling together most of the traditions that became the Hebrew Bible. You know, the creation story of Genesis showing a single God creating everything just by speaking. Still interesting that words are just vibrating air though. But this is when monotheism really took hold. The exile and the writing of the Bible locked in their idea of one universal God, which started to set Judaism apart from its neighbors. And it's important to notice this transition wasn't happening in a vacuum, because during and after the Babylonian exile, Jewish thought was clearly significantly influenced by Zoroastrianism, which was a Persian religion. There's overwhelming, undeniable scholarly support for the idea that some aspects of the later conception of Yahweh in Judaism were clearly influenced by Zoroastrianism, especially during and after the Babylonian exile. During this whole period, Jews came into contact with Persian and Zoroastrian beliefs, which included a supreme god known as Ahura Mazda, and cosmic dualism, or good versus evil, angels, and concepts of resurrection and final judgment, and all that started to get worked into the mythology at this point. You don't see these concepts until these people started to come in contact with each other more. There's a vast amount of writings from the ancient Israelites, including the Hebrew Bible, but none of it has any clear concept of afterlife besides Sheol, which is just known as a neutral, shadowy place that everyone goes to after they die. But there definitely was no concept of a heaven or a divided form of salvation at that point. In contrast, the Gathas from Zoroastrian beliefs, they're dated to around 1000 BC, and they clearly describe an afterlife concept called the House of Song, which is described as a state of enlightenment and union with their god, Ahura Mazda. And they had the House of Lies, which is described as a state of spiritual isolation and torment. Of course, religious scholars want to question the dates, or when you explain the exact science and validity of the dating, they just say it's still not the same as the biblical heaven and hell, or the Zoroastrians were just speaking metaphorically and all that type of stuff. Regardless, the dualistic struggle between good and evil got more pronounced in Judaism after the exile, which, looking at it without any religious predisposition, you can easily see how it echoes the Zoroastrian cosmic dualism. It's also pretty crucial to realize that the idea of strict monotheism in early Israel is debated. The biblical texts themselves acknowledge the existence of other gods. References to the divine council, the Ben Elohim, or the sons of God, and the instances where Adonai is called God of gods or King of gods. This all can suggest a more complex picture than strict monotheism. In Deuteronomy, Adonai is one of the Ben Elohim, and he receives Israel as an inheritance from the Most High. There's so many examples, but the concept of strict monotheism as we understand it today is obviously more of a post-biblical development, and it doesn't fully represent the early Israelite beliefs without twisting and bending and omitting the very texts that they consider to be infallible and divinely inspired. So out of this period, around 450 to 350 BC, Judaism emerged with the focus on worshiping the one God and studying the Torah. This started to form into the foundation for billions of people, and it didn't stop there. Of course, Christianity and Islam both built directly on these roots, and even after this monotheism took over, the ideas about God kept evolving. The Jewish thinkers in the Greek and Roman worlds mixed in their philosophy, and later mystics like the Kabbalists started trying to explore hidden sides of the divine. There was a Roman writer named Macrobius in the 5th century AD. Even he saw the similarities between the Jewish god Yahweh, and he linked him to the sun as a supreme deity, which is just one of the many examples that reflect the syncretistic tendencies of all of this. Of course, some esoteric traditions like Gnosticism also explored the divine in new ways. Sometimes they would cast the Old Testament God in a complex and even negative light, and they all solve certain problems and clear up certain contradictions, but then of course they create even more. So maybe sometime we can have some fun with some of the alternative theories like Yahweh as an alien or tied to the Anunnaki, but those honestly aren't supported by the actual historical, archaeological, or textual evidence, and appealing to some grand conspiracy always breaks down on multiple levels, especially when you have competing ideologies with reasons to exploit these ideas choosing not to, because even they know there's no evidence at all besides paranoid speculation and anecdotes. But regardless, the real story that's grounded in evidence is way more interesting anyway. It's all about how a local elemental deity became the one God at the heart of 3 world religions. The whole journey from wind and fire and dreams to the universal God of billions, to me, is one of the most incredible stories in human history. And I think understanding it can enrich the mind and show us the deep, dynamic, and sometimes surprising roots of our beliefs. It shows how the human search for meaning and for connection to something bigger than us has helped shape and reshape our understanding of the divine. So that search and that story, it still continues today at this very moment. And I appreciate all of you joining me on this journey. This was another dream session. If you're interested in any of this, check out my page where we talk about dream psychology, ancient history, and symbolism. I have some courses coming up to help people understand ancient symbolism and apply it to everyday life. Those are going to connect to some dream courses on how to remember your dreams and how to lucid dream, and then how to interpret those dreams accurately. I also have a free ebook available. If you're interested in learning how to remember your dreams, you'll find a link for that in my profile or in the comment section or the description, depending on where you're at. Or you could just email me at dkdreamkeeper1@gmail.com. dkdreamkeeper1@gmail.com. I'll send you a copy of my free ebook on how to remember and master your dreams. And I also have merchandise available in my Etsy shop. You can find dream journals in there, personalized things like hats, hoodies, if you're interested in any of these type of styles. I appreciate all you beautiful souls, or Ruachs. Peace and love, people.